but weren't able to. So we're going to record it for people, or if you have to leave early, we'll have a recording that you'll be able to watch. So let's just give it one more minute and then we'll get started. But we're all glad you're here to join us. And Professor Reed, we're really happy to have you. Like I said, we have our Dean, Ian Solomon, our Associate Dean, Jay Shimjak are both here. So we're really glad you're joining us. And I think we can get started with our introduction. We're really happy that everyone is here to join us today for a presentation by Dr. Wornie Reed, Policing and African Americans, What the Data Say. Dr. Reed is a recently retired, we were just talking about, congratulations, a recently retired, but still extremely active professor of sociology and Africana studies, and director of the Race and Social Policy Research Center at Virginia Tech. A prominent part of Dr. Reed's academic experience before Virginia Tech was developing and directing 3 large social science research centers at 3 different universities. Dr. Reed earned his BS degree in secondary education, science and math at Alabama State University, and then his master's degree and Ph.D. degrees in sociology from Boston University. Trained as a medical sociologist under a health services research training fellowship, Professor Reed has taught research courses, conducted research, and published numerous articles and 8 books on medical care, health and illness, urban communities, and criminal justice. He directed the project, The Assessment of the Status of African Americans, which involves 61 scholars from all across the country, a project that ultimately produced 4 books. With a fascinating multidisciplinary and truly cross-sector background before his academic career, Dr. Reed worked in the computer field with the U.S. Bureau of the Census as a computer programmer and with IBM as a systems engineer and a marketing representative. He served a 3-year term as president of the National Congress of Black Faculty, and he is also a past president of the National Association of Black Sociologists. And as he was saying to some of us before we started, he's also a accomplished athlete across many fields. So he has a lot to share with us today. And so without further ado, we'll get started. He's going to speak give us his presentation, and then we'll ask you to put your questions in the chat, and then we'll help moderate and have time for Q&A at the end. Thanks everyone who's here today. And we'll get started without further ado. Thank you, Dr. Reed.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me to be here with you today. I'm very pleased to discuss the issue that I'll discuss today. I want to discuss with you a critical issue of social justice and a critical issue for American democracy. Between 2013 and 2016, at least 4,024 American citizens were killed by police officers. Only 85 of these cases led to an officer being charged with a crime. And in only 6 of these situations did it lead to convictions, even though many of these people were unarmed when they were killed.
How's your salad?
I'm sorry? Okay. Police violence is a leading cause of death for young men in the United States. Over the life course, 1 in every 1,000 black men can expect to be killed by police. Blacks are killed at 3 times the rate of whites. And that's...
Sorry, I don't know that one.
That's significant.
I can learn your voice.
Will you excuse me a moment?
Would you like to try it?
I have my Alex is in the room and she's responding to me, and I hope you don't hear it. So let me turn that off. I am sorry about that, but I usually do Zooms from this room. I taught courses from this room and with Alex on, and that has never happened before. So I don't know what words I said that triggered it, but that's what happened. So please excuse me. I just said that the police kill around 1,000 American citizens a year. And that is obviously too many. But even in that context, they kill blacks at 3 times the rate of whites. And in these killings, blacks are 30% more likely to be unarmed than whites. Another thing that I hope you may have noticed is that the killing of black Americans went on or has continued unabated since the George Floyd murder. And we had all of those demonstrations all over the country and all over the world, with millions of people demonstrating about this social justice issue. And yet we had no diminution of the numbers and rates of whites and blacks killed by police. And you would have thought there would have been some reduction in the rate of killing blacks because of the attention to it by so much of the world, but it did not happen. And what I want to suggest to you today is 2 or 3 reasons why there's been no diminution of this killing of blacks. First, I want to argue that it would appear that police officers have a license to kill. And I mean that specifically, not because they have a gun, and in some instances, I mean they have almost an open right to kill. And I argue that this came about in 1989 with the Graham v. Connor decision. This decision changed the view of looking at the police officer's use of force from that of an individual encountering a police action, and this action possibly being an infringement on their Fourth Amendment rights. It changed from that to with some consideration of the police officer's rights. So it went from an individual's rights being infringed to whether a police officer would be in his or her rights to have to do this use of force. And so that was kind of turning it upside down. That was bad enough, but it got a little bit more problematic, in my view, by one sentence in this decision, which was written by Justice William Rehnquist. And he argued that we must pay some attention to the officer's fear in the situation and not do post hoc analysis. So they came up with something that people in this field call the reasonableness standard. There's the reasonable actions of a reasonable police officer in the field. But the problematic aspect of this, as I see it, is that if the officer fears for their life in the situation, then they may be presumed to have a right to act accordingly. And if we find out that later on there is no weapon, there is no gun, there is no knife, there's nothing, then according to this one sentence in this Supreme Court decision, then we can't do and apply that post hoc analysis, because we must operate on the basis of an officer acting on the spur of the moment. And I argue that that gives officers a license to kill. Okay. So in practice, then, the emphasis moved from a legal or moral criteria toward the regular behavior of a law enforcement officer or the law enforcement profession. And in some cases, police officers have avoided prosecution for an extrajudicial killing because they said they feared that the person was reaching for an imaginary gun. I want you to think back of some of the videos you've seen over the last couple of years, and how it was that prosecution did not prosecute these officers who shot clearly unarmed and unaggressive black people. Now, this is an assumption that provides a privilege to police officers that ordinary citizens do not have. And the current question is whether that policy is consistent with individual rights under the Constitution. So let me give you an example. Supposing that at least one or two of you are in a room right now with someone else, maybe, and supposing you got a little concerned about this other person and pull out your gun and shot and killed him, and said afterwards that you thought they were reaching for a gun and would kill you with that gun, so you had to protect yourself, you know very well that that would not be a good defense. However, that has been the defense for many police officers, that they feared for their life and they had to act on the moment. And the Supreme Court decision said we can't judge them post hoc. Now, some people who hear me argue that say that that's not exactly what the Supreme Court decision says, but they do agree with me that in operation, sometimes that's the way it works. And so I go from the operation back to the definition that people apply. So we have a situation where police officers seem to have a license to kill. But another problematic aspect of this, probably the most problematic, is that police officers have this license to kill, but police union contracts, in effect, shield them from prosecution. Campaign Zero has studied over 500 police union contracts across the country and found most of them problematic. Most of these contracts limit officer interrogations after alleged misconduct. They mandate the destruction of disciplinary records. And you may know this because you keep reading about police officers being hired in another jurisdiction after being fired in a previous one. Well, there's no record of that because the police union contract said the disciplinary records have to be destroyed after a certain period of time. Some of these union contracts ban civilian oversight. They prevent anonymous civilian complaints, and they limit the length of internal investigations. One of the most egregious provisions in these contracts is the limitation of interrogations of officers who are accused of misconduct. So imagine if before interrogating a suspect, a police officer had to provide the suspect with written statements from all witnesses with knowledge of the crime. Also imagine if, before conducting interrogations, police officers were required to give suspects and their attorneys a full and truthful accounting of all the evidence before them. And imagine if the police were required to provide all suspects and their attorneys with advance notice, anywhere from 24 hours to 10 days in length, before conducting the interrogation. If police departments had to face that kind of regulation of their activities, they would resist that kind of limitation on their work would obviously restrict their ability to prosecute criminals, and they would be correct if they had to face these, but police officers don't have to face this. Yet that is precisely what many police union contracts require when the suspects are police officers. Thus, we have one set of procedures for law enforcement and another for other citizens. Okay. A third problematic issue that shields police officers is the Law Enforcement Bill of Rights. I'm going to presume that most of you have never heard of this, but about 20 states have Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And why should police officers have rights that other citizens do not have? About 20 states have such a right. And so without going through any details about what provisions are there, I want to assure you that Virginia is one of those 20 states. And in the LEBO, as we call it, the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, in Virginia, a police officer accused of misconduct cannot be interrogated for 5 days. Okay? And that's something to consider. Most union contracts require 2 days. Virginia goes to 5 days, but there are some that require even more time. Okay. So, what are some remedies for these three situations? We have the Graham v. Connor reasonableness standard. We have the police union contracts, which may be the big bear in the room. And we have the LEBO. Now, before I go into remedies, let me argue one other point, is that since the George Floyd killings, we had all kinds of suggestions and efforts by states and for legislatures in these states to do things to try to prevent the kinds of killings that occurred, say, with George Floyd. But I put my reputation and my personal being on the line to suggest to you that there will be no change in the killing of American citizens in general or African Americans in particular if police union contracts are not addressed. Okay. So what can we do? Well, one of the suggestions that came up quite often was, well, we need more training. And as someone asked me the other day, can we train the police out of this behavior? And I say emphatically, no. Training will not do it. Training is based upon the assumption that these activities are activities of individual officers. They are activities of individual officers, but they don't start with the officer. So let's eliminate this idea about the rogue police officer, the bad apple in the barrel that is affecting the rest. Excessive use of force is an attribute of police departments and their practices. Racism in the use of excessive force is an attribute of police departments. And we will not be able to train the police out of this behavior because we are addressing the wrong entity. Police are being trained to have their current behavior by the policies and practices of the police departments. For the social sciences in the group, I would argue that it is the sociological analysis of this that will get us somewhere. So, since we're concerned about these departments, we get concerned about the patterns and practices of the departments. And when President Obama left office, there were 25 jurisdictions around the country that were under formal investigations by the Justice Department. Okay, including, say, Chicago, which you may know about. Okay, and including some others. But when the new administration came in and Jeff Sessions became the Attorney General, he dropped all 25 of these investigations. Now, the policies and practices investigations will get us somewhere because we're talking about forcing the reform and change of police departments in general. Okay. The current Attorney General has restored a few of these patterns and practices provisions. And by the way, this comes from legislation in Congress in the early 1990s, which gives the federal government the ability to do this, to go in and take over departments that are doing injustice to citizens. Okay, or appear to be doing injustice, and the Justice Department determines whether this is true and then what remedies may come from that. Okay. Now let's go to police union contracts. It is obvious, I think it should be, that if we don't change police union contracts, we can change all these other things and nothing will change. Now, the District of Columbia has reined in the outsized power of these police union contracts. The council recently passed legislation that bans the inclusion of all matters about discipline of law enforcement from the union contracts. Virginia has a unique opportunity right now that many of us are pushing, and that is to deal with the police union contracts. Virginia, being one of these so-called right-to-work states, did not permit public agencies' employees to unionize until the spring of 2020. But when they did this, that enabled police officers and police departments to unionize. And while unionization is something that I support and that many of the people I work with support, we do not support police union contracts. And so right now, as police unions organize in the state as a result of the legislation last year, we have to be careful at what goes into the police union contracts. And we argued that they should be limited to issues of compensation and benefits and not have anything in there about discipline, to not have anything in there about oversight, and so on. Okay, and so we're pushing very hard for that. We must limit these contracts. Another thing that is happening that I'd like to report to you is the union movement has gotten involved with this issue. Police union contracts have gotten so out of hand that other major police unions are coming forth and taking a stand against them. During the protests last spring and summer, many people called for the AFL-CIO to expel the International Union of Police Association because of these union contracts and their violations of social justice and racial justice. The Association of Flight Attendants adopted a resolution demanding that police unions address racism in law enforcement. The Service Employees International Union, with 2 million members, has pushed for holding public security unions like police accountable to racial justice. In Seattle, a labor union coalition has issued an ultimatum to the local police union to acknowledge and address racism or be kicked out of the alliance. Even the janitors union in Seattle has weighed in. The Twin Cities Union, representing thousands of janitors, has suggested that community residents be permitted to participate in the negotiations of union contracts so as to have some control over what's happening there. And these are the kinds of things that need to be done if we are to stem the tide of police killings of American citizens in general and African Americans in particular. And I think I've used up a lot of my time, so I think I'll stop there and entertain any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Reed, for your insights and giving us a new lens with which to look at these issues. Now, I was surprised to learn about some of the things you mentioned, but I'm going to, before I have any questions, I want to open it up to our audience. You can either raise your hand or use the chat feature, and then Dr. Reed will take your questions. Who wants to start us off? I'm looking for the hand raising feature, or like I said, you can use the chat as well. Well, I'll start. I was curious. Last summer, we heard a presentation from the perspective of someone from the Vera Institute who was seeking to attack this through the Vera Institute, who was looking at this through the lens of reforming prosecutions. And I was, from a prosecutor's perspective, I was curious about your thoughts on the roles of prosecutors in cracking this problem as well.
I just wanted to limit the kinds of things I talked about so I wouldn't go too long here. But it's almost ludicrous to have prosecutors in jurisdictions that work every day with police officers to prosecute them. That kind of, well, since it may not be ludicrous to everyone, let me explain why I think so. Prosecutors, think about your television shows. That part of it works pretty well, that the collaboration between the prosecutor and the police officers. The prosecutors depend upon police officers to bring and testify on the cases. You know, they do the arrest and they must be there to support the case. And so prosecutors depend upon that a lot. So they work hand in hand. It's like having the prosecution done by a member of the family. Okay. And I don't think you could kind of trust me to be a prosecutor for my brother. Okay. And so we shouldn't trust prosecutors, no matter how nice they may be, no matter how they tend to argue that they will be objective. There are some overwhelming assumptions and attitudes that are at play here that will prevent the prosecution. For example, think about George Floyd. Look how long it was before the prosecutor even did anything in that case. Think about, I know these are isolated cases, but think about Ferguson, where the county prosecutor actually went in and made a case against prosecution. And I talked to my son, who was at the time an assistant prosecutor in Manhattan. I told him I thought the prosecutor was supposed to make the case for prosecution not the case against prosecution. And my son told me, yes, that's the case, and that he had had 100 times he'd gone before uh, grand juries and had only failed to get a prosecution once. He said it is true that you can indict a ham sandwich. So no, so if we don't remove the prosecution from the case, then we're going to not move very far along.
Yeah, I
So
think we had it.
I argued that they should be done by the state attorney general's office.
That's what I was going to ask you that question. We had a question. We got a question in the chat, but first we had a question from Ebony in our audience. Ebony, where?
Oh, yeah. Hello.
Hello.
Good. Good afternoon now. So my question was about your. Oh, I'm pinned. um, so I just had a quick question about the law that you saw in '89 that was changed and how that shaped your research. What helped you come to that conclusion that
Just
was
reading that decision, I was led to it by a person who was reviewing the situation through uh, legal approaches. And so basically, he started with something I knew about in 1984. There was a case of Tennessee versus Garner, uh, which abolished the fleeing felon rule and saying that shooting a person in the back who's running away like they did in North Charlotte was illegal, the Supreme Court said. It was not illegal before 1984. By the way, think about this picture of a guy's last name was Scott, who was running away. He had been stopped because of some problem with his auto. And the police, and he wanted to run away because he didn't want the guy to look up and see that he had some other warrants and so on. So he began to run away. And the police officer is clearly seen shooting him in the back as he ran away. Now, that was legal until 1984. And when the Supreme Court abolished the free and felon law to say that that was a violation of the person's Fourth Amendment rights against search and seizure. But in 1989, they changed the emphasis from whether it was a violation of the the citizens' rights to whether or not the police officer was within their right. And it seemed to me that they are emphasizing the activities of a profession rather than the constitutional rights of a citizen. And so that's kind of started me there. I have worked, by the way, in criminal justice virtually all of my career. My first thing was medical sociology. My second thing was criminal justice because I did a study of a prison while I was still a graduate student. But I stepped aside about 5 years ago to begin to study. So I spent that a year studying this issue. Why is it that police officers get away with murder? Basically, that's what. And so you've seen kind of the kind of highlights of what I found. There's some other issues, but that's the highlights of what I found. So that's how I got into it. And I did ask one of our senators, is it possible to change that reasonable standards idea? And he said yes, because he said it was not a constitution. That part was not a constitutional issue, so it could be changed. So we need to get around to changing that as well.
Thank you.
All right, we have a couple questions in the chat. The first is, what is the best source for statistics on police killings as they relate to race? If this person says, if I wanted to demonstrate to someone that blacks are killed at a 3 times higher rate than Caucasians, where would I point them?
Well, first, I'd like to point out that the place that you cannot look in the government, the federal government in this country, because they don't keep records of that. Okay. And so the best place to look is the, it's the cause of death data that is provided, I think, from CDC. I've forgotten the source. I've looked it up many times, and so that's one of the reasons. If you don't want to do that because you don't get, that's just clear. Did the police kill the person or did they not? It doesn't provide you with any other information. But you can get other information if you look at the Guardian. So when I was studying this 5 years ago, the Guardian was the best place. But now there are a couple of other places that look at it very closely. The Washington Post looks at it very closely. And so they keep records of it as well. Okay, but when I was looking at this, the best source was the Guardian. So these are newspaper organizations that follow each of these cases that become public. And so this is the public knowledge. This is why I said at least 4,024 people were killed in that 4-year period. We don't know, and many of us suspect that more were killed. It just didn't become public knowledge.
Next question is a great policy school question. In terms of solving this issue, do you think it is worth reforming the police contracts and reversing Supreme Court decisions, if assuming those things could be done, or is it more useful to create a new system that replaces the current policing system altogether?
I think the latter, but if we let the new police establish police union contracts, we'll be back in the same situation. So therefore, I have to lean toward the second issue, and that is reforming the police union contracts. Because if we reform the contracts such that the contracts do not shield police from investigation, interrogation, and so on, then I belong to the school of if you change the policy enough, it'll change the behavior. And so that's why I'm saying for policy school question, then if we change those policies, that will change the behavior. Sometimes we, as you know by now, studying what you do in public policy, that people jump too quickly to what the individual does. But the individual is influenced by the social, which is often influenced by the policy.
We have another question from our audience, our virtual audience. Courtney Hawkins, you are next.
Hi, Mr. Reed. Thank you for calling on me. You mentioned consent decrees, law enforcement Bill of Rights, and dealing with the disciplinary actions that need to take place within police departments. What type of disciplinary actions do you think can happen before a consent decree is put out, like in Baltimore Police Department and the New York Police Department?
I don't follow the consent decrees that closely because they don't change enough of the policy. So I'm not. I wouldn't consider myself expert on that. Mm-hmm. But I'm an opponent of tinkering around the edges. Let me explain. I've been, especially since I think we have students here, I've been arguing for years that the difference between liberals and progressives is this. Liberals think that you can tinker around the edges. They think that the institutions are sound and solid, and therefore we can reform the institutions. Progressives know better. They know that the institutions must be changed. So I would say that the consent decree may be a liberal one, but unless you change the institution, then you will not get good change, because it's not like the police just ran off the rails. The police department has always had an excessive support for doing the wrong that they do. Now, let me quickly add that I work with the police here in Montgomery County, and I've been working with them for 10 years. So it's not like I stand on the sidelines and yell and scream. They have heard some of this, and we have discussed this, and we have been working to try to improve not necessarily union contracts because they don't have union contracts yet, but to improve the operation of police departments, like one of the things I did not mention in my talk today, and that's racial profiling. Most of these incidents that make it to the public are the result of racial profiling by police. And so I work with them, so I'm not a person that just stands off to the side and throws Molotov cocktails. I work with them all the time. Much of the time we agree, sometimes we disagree, but we all lock together in one committee that we have to work on. And the public expects us to do that, so the police can't quit.
We have another question from the audience, and then we've got another one in the chat, but we'll go first to the audience, to Taylor Paul.
All right, thank you, Dr. Reed, for being here. My question is, in your expertise in trying to counsel a Black chief in whom may be dealing with rogue officers within his department, or having a department within his department that secretly or openly defy his leadership, how will you counsel them?
Oh, well, I'll counsel them to get on our side of the argument to change the police union contracts, which would make it much easier to discipline people who are out of control, because he won't be able to control them too much with the current police union contracts. I don't know whether people thought a lot about that, but that's a consequence of providing so much power to police officers. And so when you have someone who's an administrator, the administrator has less power than the police officers. And those of you who don't believe me, go check, who are studying this public policy issue closely, go check this out.
Thank you.
All right, we have a question in the chat from Bryce Holland, who said, on a recent visit to DC during the summer, I had a conversation with an African-American police officer who was telling him that the structure in his department was arranged so that he felt he was excluded and ostracized in the department. He found that white officers became buddies with department heads and received more promotions and advancements. Do you find this to be a common problem, and is there an agency working to correct this problem? And as Bryce says, I am sure this perpetuates the systemic racism that characterizes the police department across America.
Well, to answer the last question first, I think that the Association of Black Police Officers tries to work with that. But I guess I want to be careful in how I respond to this, not because I'm afraid of saying something, but because for so long I had virtually no respect for Black police officers working in these departments. Recently, I've been working trying to get more Black police hired by these departments. So I've changed a little bit that, because to work with people who believe that some of the answers may be there. But what this officer described to you was, it's like saying it's Monday. That's just the way it is. In fact, if you don't think that's the way it is, go back and look at some of the interviews with Lloyd Austin, who is Secretary of Defense, and hear about his experience as an African man in the military, which is has much more control over people under it than, say, police departments. So it's a routine, everyday occurrence for Black police officers, and that's what I hear from them all the time.
We have other questions out there. I want to make sure I'm not missing anyone in the audience with the hand raised. Other questions? I was curious, Dr. Reed, I actually did not know about the Bill of Rights and the delay, and that it's a permissible thing that you can have a sort of delayed interrogation and delayed investigation. And I was just curious, are there any other other fields that have a similar Bill of Rights that gives someone a guarantee to a delay before they can be interviewed?
Not that I know of. In fact, they have other egregious provisions. One is that uh, the police departments don't have to release the video cams. In other words, if the police officers wear the video cams and it's running while they are engaged in their work, that's just for the police department to use. They don't have to show those to citizens in Virginia. I kind of know this because I was involved in an issue for where a 19-year-old Keontae Spencer was killed in Roanoke County. And because of a lot of protestations from a lot of us, they did show the video to the family, but they have never shown it to the public. So these are some conditions right around us. We don't have to go way far afield to see these things. And I'm just want to point those out, and that we need to pay attention to them, and we need to change them.
Any other questions from our audience? None I have. I'm curious how you would what you would recommend policies. What are some of the best ways that our new policy students can get involved in helping?
Okay, well, I have one good way. I had a small organization that is an offshoot of a larger organization that I've been a part of for years in Southwest Virginia here, in fact, in Montgomery County. And this one is called Combating Racial Injustice Police Reform Committee. And one of the ways to get involved is to get involved with us, because we're very active in trying to push for meetings with other state legislators. I've met with some, but we're trying to meet with more, and many of them are too busy right now until the election, and we're a little concerned about that. We're talking mostly about police union contracts, but LIBOR is involved in that very significantly. So that's one way to get specifically involved. You can get involved by reading our newsletter. So try to subscribe to it, and it's under the website Combating Racial Injustice Police Reform. I've forgotten exactly how we term it, but you should be able to find it there. This is something that grew out of my Race and Social Policy Research Center, but it is kind of independent of the university, and it was just work that we've been doing for this committee only for the last year and a half. So that's one way to get involved, and I am trying to, in fact, we are trying to coordinate with other such community groups in the county, in the state, to address some of these issues. But for instance, the reason I'm really emphasizing the Combating Racial Injustice Police Reform issue is because we are pushing for specific legislation. And this legislation is legislation that would limit police union contracts. And we're very specific about this. We have acquainted the state legislators, but we haven't kind of met with them and had a chance to go back and forth so they could ask all their questions. And I'm going to be meeting soon. I'll be talking Thursday evening to the local Democratic committee in this county, and I'm going to tell them that they have been snookered. Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, the issue to unionize public agencies was put forth by a conservative in the legislature. And since unionization is always something that Democrats have favored, all the Democrats are on board. but they're on board with uh, putting in place something that could lead to the situation we have in every other state almost. And that is these police union contracts that are out of control. And so I would suggest that one of the ways to get involved is to get involved there. And some of you may have suggestions to us. We're open to suggestions about how to push this. I'll tell you, we work very closely with Campaign Zero. You should look them up. Campaign Zero is kind of an outgrowth of the Black Lives Matter movement. And they're the ones who've studied like nearly 600 police departments. And we have worked very closely with them to develop our ideas about what we should do. And you can look them up. That's kind of national, but we are kind of local.
Well, those are both great ideas to start, and I'm looking to see. I think we've covered our questions, and we're just really appreciative of the time you spent with us today and really opening our eyes to some additional. We've had some of these important discussions at the Batten School, but I think your perspective is definitely unique and very much appreciated. So we're glad you joined us today.
Well, I can deal with contrary points if somebody wants to make one to me.
Anyone out there? Maybe we'll have some maybe there'll be some follow-up emails. I'm not sure.
Okay, that would be. I will respond. I promise you.
If anyone would like to further engagement, is it okay if I share your email address with them?
That's quite all right.
All right. We'll look forward to that. And to those of you who were with us today, we appreciate you being with us virtually. We will follow up. We traditionally would have had a big gathering in our green hall, Dr. Reed, with lunch, and we would have taken it, but it just is not appropriate to do that with the pandemic raging. So to everyone online, we'll follow up with you with your lunch voucher, and we will hopefully invite you for an in-person visit in the future when it's safe to do so. Actually.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us, everyone, and be well.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.